Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our panel, which is titled Climate Change and Conflict, Preparedness for Growing Risks. My name is Cosmin Dobran. I represent the European Union, and I will be the moderator of this session. Thank you very much for being us today. Let me start by saying that this topic is extremely important. Today is the first day of the COP in Baku, but also we have the outcome of the elections in the United States, and I'm sure that there will be questions in that regard. Before I introduce the panel, let me say a few words about what the European Union is doing on climate change and security. And let me focus on two main things. First, we look at the climate change and security from a risk multiplier perspective. What that means, it means that basically climate change does not per se produce conflict, but it can actually lead to conflict. And this is an important element because it will influence exactly how we look at the policies that we do, but also at the concrete actions. The second thing that we do in the EU, we have mapped all the policies and the programs that we have on peace, security, and defense, and we try to identify elements that would basically look at the conflict, the nexus between conflict and climate change, and then adapt these policies to make sure that basically we look at the prevention rather than crisis management angle. This is important because we think that climate change and security is in one area where basically we can do something to reduce the possibility of conflict. And it's not about large-scale projects, it's about small things that can be done in different parts of the world and basically to alleviate tensions between different communities. So let me now move to introducing the panel. We have Dr. Dinopati Jalal, who is a former Indonesian ambassador to the US and Vice Foreign Minister of Indonesia. And Mr. Jalal heads the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, a policy organization for Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Then we have Mohamud Raj of the Elman Peace and Human Rights Center in Somalia. You are here as you, together with the Kofi Annan Foundation, just finalized a report documenting youth perspectives on climate and security in a number of countries, including Somalia. And last but not least, we have Elisa Jobson, who is the head of Advocacy International Crisis Group. And let me share with you that the EU follows crisis groups reporting very closely, including its reporting on the link between climate and conflict. So let's start our session, and I will start with the question to Mr. Jalal. Climate change is a risk multiplier, but its effects are not even. What challenges are Indonesia facing, and what role do international partnerships play in responding to climate security challenges, especially in the current geopolitical context?
Well, first, thank you, Cosmin, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to share stories and updates from my country on climate change. You asked me about climate risks and the possibility of conflicts resulting from climate change. You know, I must say, coming from Indonesia, when we think about conflicts and security issues, you know, it used to be about foreign intervention or foreign armies coming to Indonesia, as had happened before, identity issues, communal violence, and so on. And that was in the 20th century. But I think in the 21st century, what is different is that climate change has become more and more important in the security challenge that we face. I mean, this was brought home when in 2004 we had the tsunami, right? Again, it's not climate change exactly, but it is one form of natural disasters. And during that tsunami, 200,000 people died in 30 minutes. right? No foreign army had ever done that to us, and 500,000 people were left homeless in Aceh. The economy was paralyzed. The whole country's rescue efforts was focused on Aceh, and the largest military operation other than war after World War II happened to the Aceh tsunami efforts, right? So that's when we started opening our eyes that probably non-conventional source of threats would become more important moving forward, and that's certainly what's happening now. The island of Java, the most condensed island in the world, about 120 million people live in the island of Java, one island alone. They're going to face, the study said they're going to lose clean water resources by 2040. And you can imagine what that would mean to villages and urban centers that would desperately need these water resources. In a 2-degree world, according to IPCC, 99% of coral reef would disappear around the world. And Indonesia is a maritime country. We are the largest archipelago in the world. I cannot imagine an Indonesia without coral reefs, but this is what's going to happen. The fish is going to go away. It's going to affect the fishermen around the coastlines, and it's going to create new forms of social conflicts. Another form of climate threat is forest fires, right? Again, things get very hot in Sumatra and in Borneo, and sometimes you can't prevent forest fires. And when this happens, it really produces migration, climate migrants, and it affects our neighbors in Singapore and Malaysia, and it has created, diplomatic, not conflict, but diplomatic disputes in the past, because they protested about Indonesia's inability to control the forest fires. The rise of sea level, that will also affect social well-being. About 195 million Indonesians are living in areas that are prone to disasters, natural disasters, and about 60% are living in the coastal areas. So the rise of sea levels is bound to produce a lot of social conflicts, and we know that migration is always not an easy issue to address. In Europe, also you see migrants becoming a political issue, although currently it's of slightly different nature. But the IOM, International Office of Migration, has predicted about 200 million people worldwide will become climate migrants. So to answer your question shortly, it's really a new era of climate security that we are facing. And I think a lot of us are trying to adjust to this new reality. The system is not necessarily ready for this. We can discuss this later. But there's definitely a case for an alignment between climate adaptation, development strategy, and national security.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Let's move to you now. Our responses to climate security challenges need to be rooted in the needs of specific contexts and situations. And it also is very important that we reflect on the needs of different groups and on how they can contribute. And based on your research on youth and climate security in Somalia, what is needed now?
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Dobran. Now, I could give you a quick response. I could tell you that we need more anticipation than has been put forth till now. I feel that our research has shown that there has been a lot of reactory approaches, but it's time for anticipation. It is evident that extreme weather conditions as well as violence, which are recurrent, cannot be treated as something to react to. We have to start treating them as something to predict. And it's evident from our research, which has looked at how young people are affected by the multiple phases of threats involving climate change and conflict at the same time. And although we've done it in a city focused right outside of Mogadishu, it's called Afgoye, about 35 kilometers. We've done this as part of a wider research program together with the Kofi Annan Foundation, CIPRI, as well as 5 youth-led organizations from Niger, Uganda, Philippines, Burkina Faso, Somalia, as well as Mali. Now, what we've come to understand from the over 1,000 young people that we've consulted is that resource scarcity inevitably leads to violence. In the context of Somalia, where we understand that climate change and environmental degradation is intensifying competition for resources, 53% of young people who have responded to our survey have experienced resource-based conflicts. With agro-pastoral societies being prevalent in Somalia, and traditional elders as well as local elders having made clear that it's a sector that has historically been significant, it shouldn't also then be a surprise that about more than a majority feel that this increase in resource competition or access to these resources is also leading to increased arms proliferation. Now, when you then combine this with the state's failure to protect and provide the very people it's supposed to serve, you leave a gap for armed groups like Al-Shabaab to step in and fill that void. And as I'm mentioning this, I recall the testimony of Mahad, a young man from Afgoye who made clear in our research and shared with us his experience of being recruited into Al-Shabaab, a terrorist group that operates out of Somalia. And he pointed to the fact that they promised safety and security for his family. They promised safety and security for their livestock and crops. And they also guaranteed his freedom to movement. Those are 3 things that the government could not provide to the very people that came from that same area. So of course, in that sense, Mahad, although not agreeing with Al-Shabaab's mission and vision, he's still connected to them. Because he could find something that he wasn't able to find in the very society that he lives in. Now, this then calls for the development of capacity of young people to be able to lead climate and peace projects. After then developing this capacity, it's then important to allocate resources that will eventually foster youth-led climate adaptation projects and policies and inform international policy discussions. One other thing that young people also mentioned to us was very important to them in our research was that there was a lack of intergenerational and cross-disciplinary approaches. So although there is the peace field and then there's the climate field, there isn't many approaches that are cross-disciplinary outside of forums like this. We had 2/3 of young people believe that the decisions we make today will inevitably impact the people or the future generations of tomorrow. And young people are very motivated. They're very compelled to participate in the decision-making processes and the bettering of their own future. But at the same time, they're also in the space where they're perceiving the government to pursue the security approach rather than pursuing a combined approach to both climate and security. Now, this combined with young people's lack of access to proper financing, proper upskilling, to be able to deliver solutions has made us understand that as young people, we're disadvantaged by design, not by choice. And this then calls for a drastic change in how we approach these issues. We need to develop cross-disciplinary approaches that address the interdependency of both climate and peace/security. It's also very important to be able to invest in young people's training, provide them with financing, as well as the opportunities to be upskilled and share best practices and experiences with other young people who are also in the field so that we can expect a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. What you have just said reminds me of discussion that we had last year in Paris at the previous edition of the Peace Forum, where we discuss youth peace and security, and it's precisely the need to understand this interconnection between conflict, climate change, also environmental degradation, because actually in many countries it's about environmental degradation rather than climate change, and how this affects the special groups, and I think the youth definitely is one of the groups which is most affected. And in the end, it's about the future of the planet and the places, how we want to shape that. So thank you very much for sharing that. Elisa, moving to you. And I don't need to introduce the International Crisis Group, but over the past years, Crisis Group has increasingly engaged on the climate and security nexus. What does your data and analysis tell us, and what would your recommendations to policymakers be?
Thanks, Cosmin. I think I want to start by saying half of the most climate fragile countries also face conflict and crises. If you actually flip that around, it's even more stark. 70% of the most climate-stressed parts of the world are in conflict. And as you said earlier, whilst the relationship between climate change and deadly conflict is complex and it's also context-specific, it's a threat multiplier, which we can see is already increasing food security, insecurity, water scarcity, and resource competition, whilst disrupting livelihoods and spurring migration. So Crisis Group sees two sets of risks that today and we think over the next 2 decades will have devastating consequences. First, as climate change accelerates, it will intensify risks to peace and security. Extreme weather events such as prolonged droughts and flooding, which are increasing in frequency and severity, inflame existing socio-political tensions. These events heighten stress on already vulnerable communities, increasing the likelihood of unrest and conflict over resources. Second, climate-induced crises exacerbate instability by deepening food insecurity, worsening water scarcity, and intensifying competition over natural resources. For example, as droughts dry up water sources, communities must travel further or encroach on others' territories, igniting disputes that can escalate into broader violence. This dynamic is more often pronounced when government is weak and resource distribution is already contested. The Horn of Africa is particularly affected by these changes, and I'd like to sort of give an example of how this plays out in practice in South Sudan. So South Sudan is still recovering from a brutal civil war, but it's faced historic flooding since 2019, which has submerged vast areas of the country, intensified food insecurity, and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. The UN estimates that some 472,000 people have been affected by the floods this year, and that was by the end of August, which was not the peak rainy season. As pastoralist groups move south to escape floodwaters, they enter regions already inhabited by long-standing farming communities, and this heightens competition over land and resources. Tensions between the newly displaced herders, who bring large herds and often come from politically influential ethnic groups in South Sudan, they mix with Equatorian farmers whose land that they're moving on to, and this mix is exacerbated by Sudan's historical grievances. Attempts by the government to resolve these conflicts through presidential orders for herders to return north have largely failed, underscoring the need for structured political dialogue, but also some robust frameworks to address competing claims over land and resources. Both the displaced herders and the host communities have been militarized as a result of the civil war, which just feeds into this cycle of conflict. So you asked me what policymakers can do. I mean, so there's 3 things I think. One, and Mohammed touched on it, sort of anticipatory action. And at Crisis Group, we're actually developing an early warning conflict early warning system, which is piloted in South Sudan but will move to Somalia, which allows us to take the data that we have and make sure that it gets to people who need it so that they can take action. So providing support and funding to anticipatory work is really important. Speaking about finance, there's a few points here. One, the availability of funding. Countries affected by climate change and conflict receive on average just 1/3 of the amount of climate financing on a per capita basis as is received by countries that are free of conflict. So more funding needs to go to affected countries. For example, South Sudan has only received 1% of the adaptation funding it requires to meet the targets that it's set out in its own 5-year plan to reduce emissions. For Somalia, it's just 5%. So, these countries need more funding. And that funding needs to be more accessible. Conflict-affected countries face significant barriers when they're accessing funds. There's a plethora of different climate funds, each with different application and accountability processes. And applying for those funds requires capacity at the national level, which puts conflict-affected countries at a real disadvantage. The answer there is that we need to streamline and standardise these processes to make it easier for conflict-affected countries to access them. The third area around funding that I think it's important that policymakers can take action on is the actual putting the funds into practice. In areas where there's existing conflict, inadequate planning or conflict-sensitive approaches to climate projects can worsen tensions. For example, implementing large-scale water or agricultural projects without community buy-in can lead to competition and hostility if local groups feel excluded or deprived of resources. So it's really important that more conflict sensitivity when developing and implementing climate projects is applied. And then the third area where I think policymakers can engage is around taking climate security out of the silos that it's placed into in international discussions. Given the threat that climate change poses, we need to ensure that international organisations and multilateral dialogues integrate climate security as part of the key international climate and conflict-related processes. So, two aims here. One, get conflict into the global climate conversation. At COP, peace and security is siloed from the broader negotiations. However, it matters that peace and security is not separate or tangential. These are important issues to climate, and they should be involved in. They should be on the agenda, and the agenda should be addressing conflict risks. The second thing we need to do is get climate into the global security conversation. At the Security Council, climate is discussed as it relates to particular conflicts and crises, and occasionally as a thematic area. But there's real value in trying to get the Security Council to pass a resolution like one that was proposed by Niger and Ireland in 2021, which squarely sets out climate change as a strategic security risk, which demands a concerted and strategic approach. Unfortunately, the dynamics in the Security Council mean this isn't possible at the moment, but we should still keep trying to push for that.
Thank you very much, Elisa. I take from your answer basically that we need to anticipate better, we need to put more resources, and we need to link the climate change and environmental degradation with discussions on security, including at the UN Security Council, which perhaps is the most difficult thing to do. But then let me now move a little bit to what's happening on internationally with the subject, because I've been participating in many meetings about climate change and security nexus, and I think we have mapped quite well the implications and how it works, and then we have good examples from different parts of the world, and I think Mohammed gave a very clear picture on what's happening in Somalia. But what is missing out there? what are the gaps when it comes to preparedness, when it comes to resilience. And this is something which I think is for everybody. In the European Union, we have just published a report, former Finnish President Niinisto, who basically placed climate change and environmental degradation at the core of our preparedness and resilience agenda for the next 5 to 10 years. And what that means, it means that all the resources and all the discussions would have to take into consideration that aspect. From your perspective, what is it missing? Where do we need to focus our efforts on the international global agenda? Dr. Jarrell, I'll start with you.
Thank you. By the way, this concept of silent conference is just, I'm just trying to get used to this because noise outside and then, but I can hear myself and yourself, so really, really interesting. Yeah.
Silence is not exactly what's happening.
It sounds like my home actually with all the noise of the kids and so on. Look, you asked me what's missing. In my view, what I find interesting is the local solutions that tend to be underestimated. Like, I'll tell you a good story. There was a village in East Java, in a village called Bansring, and in this village of fishermen, they were bombing corals, and corals had died, and they were running out of fish, and their livelihood were threatened, right? So because of that, they started fishing in other places and produced conflict with other fishermen in other islands, right? So what did they do? They commissioned this young man to find a solution by going to a university nearby, right? And the young man went to university and then did a lot of research, and then he came back to the village and he said, look, we got to change from being fish bombers to become climate warriors, right? And he used, interestingly, a lot of Quranic verses because it's an Islamic village, and in order to convince them, they needed to rely on Islamic teaching, which he found a lot of verses. And what happened was he trained the whole village to become climate warriors, meaning they fixed the corals, right? They made sure there's no garbage around. They fixed the whole environment so that that place, that village, become a local tourist attraction for nearby cities, nearby population. And when I went there with my wife, it was unbelievable. People were swimming there. There was no garbage. The corals were there. The fish were there. Tourism was just booming and so forth. But it proved that there was a local solution to the environmental problem that they had, right? And I think a lot of these things need to be known and scaled up because really, I don't want just for us to be told by fancy international think tanks, this is what you should do, this is what you... No, they need to learn from us too. I just came back from West Sumatra, for example, and they found an interesting concept called social forestry, meaning you don't need to chop the forest to get money, to make money out of it. What you do is you keep the forest and you get the local population to live within the forest, work within the forest without chopping the forest, and the local government gets carbon credit out of it. So the government gets the money, carbon credit, the local population gets income, in fact, even more income than doing other jobs around that area, and the forest gets preserved. That's another local solution that can be scaled up. So if you ask me, where are the gaps? I think in Africa, in Indonesia, in India, in the Pacific, there are a lot of local solutions. They just need empowerment. They just need more funding, and they just need to be scaled up. I think that's what's missing.
Thank you very much. Local solutions, I actually love that. I think it's exactly what is needed, and perhaps it's not the only example that we can look at. Then the real challenge is how do we scale up and how do we transform these local solutions into an international kind of solution. I think this is extremely important. Muhammad, I'm turning to you now, and actually you alluded in your first intervention to something which caught my attention, which is the intergenerational element. From that perspective, what is it missing in all these discussions that we have and the plans that we do to actually alleviate this crisis?
Thank you. Now, when it comes to AFGOI specifically, there has been experiences shared with us of all the decisions being taken by people who it doesn't affect the most. So although it's the very young people who are the marginalized groups, it's not those people who are taking the decisions. Even though they have knowledge and have shared best practices with other young people from around other villages too, they're not invited to the table. Instead they're rejected and ignored, whereas in a perfect world, or what is missing to be exact, is their inclusion in formal advisory boards that can value their voice. It's time to formalize the strong informal networks that they already have and include them into decision-making processes that already exist. It's time that they are invited to make the decisions that impact them, first and foremost. In the case of Somalia, when it comes to the intergenerational part, it says it itself. It's people who had started working with this for 20 years ago who are still working with it, even though there's a whole new generation ready to work with it. And so that's what we need, and that's what I was referring to earlier.
Thank you very much. Elisa, you work at the, perhaps I could describe it as a strategic level, because you see the big picture. From that end, what do you think is missing?
I mean, as I said earlier, I think financing is the key missing ingredient. You know, more funding, especially for conflict-affected states, and accessibility for that funding. And I think this sort of brings in both what Dino and Mohammed were saying around listening to local communities about what they need, what the climate project should look like. Because they have knowledge, they have understanding that is really important and should be brought in and should be considered, and at the moment really isn't being. So I think sort of finding that connection to the local is really important. But essentially we need more money, and it needs to be more easily and readily available for those countries that are in conflict. You know, governments are concerned about providing financing to fragile states because they're not sure how it's going to be spent. But then we just get in a cycle. You know, we've got conflict-affected countries that can't have access to funding. You know, they're more vulnerable to climate shocks than countries that aren't in conflict. But again, they can't get the money for the mitigation, for their adaptation in particular. And so they just end up in a cycle. And we need to find a way to break that cycle.
Can I just add one thing to this? I think the big gap now is in the political will, right? I know in Europe, to get elected into executive or the parliament, you need to show your climate credentials because it's very important to the voters. But in many countries in the global south, I'm mostly speaking about in Indonesia, climate is a tough sell. Right, my group, we're trying to educate parliamentarians on climate issues. We had about 20 of them around the table, and then they told us, you know, Pat Dino, we can't campaign on the basis of climate change. We get no votes, right? And the reality is, this is happening in many global south countries, right? And you know, there's this attitude that, look, you know, let this be somebody else's business, or we can wait another 5 years, 10. There's no urgency to this. So I would love to see the political elite, the governing elite in global south countries put climate issues at the top of their agenda. And the problem is, many of them have told us it's not a vote getter issue. Right, it just doesn't appeal to many of their target audience. So you know, I think that's something that we need to think about, and you know, how to overcome and fix that. Yeah.
Absolutely, I would agree with you. Although I have to say that when everything else works, perhaps running on a green ticket actually makes a lot of sense, and I think that for the younger generations would even make more sense. So indeed, we need to reduce this gap between the politics and basically having an agenda, a green agenda in our societies. We have 10 minutes left, so I would like to open the floor to the audience. Just a short reminder that if you want to take the floor, please don't forget to use the microphone. We have a few colleagues here on the right and on the left. So we have a first question, please.
In our session, we discussed so much about climate change and the security, national security or international security, but it's really hard for me to find the direct link between the climate change and the security issues. So if and how we can build such kind of direct linkage between national security and climate change, it's really important for the people, for the different countries to get consensus, because there are so many. We just show quite a lot of cases. Evidence is on the indirectly, like resources conflict, environmental refugees, transboundary conflicts. But if and how we can make more and more strengthen this directly linkage. Second is if and we can currently, for global level, if we can build such kind of climate change and global security, like if and we can build a global surveillance network for all these security, climate security issues, and make such kind of network to just to solve for our climate change security governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me try to give a short answer, and then I'll ask the panelists to intervene as well, because I get this type of question a lot. In fact, how does it link between the climate change, environmental degradation, and security? In fact, every time you talk to people in conflict-affected areas or regions or fragility, when you talk about climate change and environmental degradation, is the one subject that actually they understand, because they are experiencing it. So for them, that's part and parcel of security. So the link is already there. It's just that the way we structure the discussions and the way we basically approach this was very fragmented. If we stop this fragmentation, then it becomes very, very straightforward. Just to take the example of the local solutions, with the local solution, you don't need to go too high to understand this link, because the more people have access to water, the more security you have. Basically, it boils down to that. I think the real challenge is basically when you try to implement policies that support both security and address the climate change. That's where the tricky part begins. But let me open this to the panel as well. So, Lisa, please go ahead.
If you're looking for a conflict which we can say 100% the cause of it is climate, you're not going to find it. But you're not going to find any conflict that has one individual cause. Every conflict is individual, it's complex, it has a wide range of different factors that feed into it. I think what's really important in this sphere is to understand that climate is increasingly becoming one of those factors which exacerbates conflict. And I think that's where the direct line comes in. It's, as I said, in South Sudan, herders are moving into areas of the country because of floods, into pastoralist areas, and that sparks conflict. And it also, the reason why the conflict is there is because there's been traditional patterns of conflict between these two groups in the past. And they're forced to move into these spaces. they're forced to compete for resources, and that increases the conflict. And we see this throughout Africa. This herder-farmer, particularly herder-farmer conflict is really affecting Somalia, it affects Kenya, it affects Mali, it affects Nigeria. But you're never going to find a single conflict that is sparked just by climate. It's not going to happen. It's a threat multiplier.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the panelists. I come from DRC, and I'm very interested to the way the panelists put their solution between Mr. Dino, talking about local solutions, and Mr. Jobson, who spoke about
This is Miss Jobson.
sorry.
I'm Mr. Rege.
Okay, so then you spoke about involving youth in the decision makers and decision solutions. I just don't find a way to combine these two solutions to the funding. Since we are suggesting solutions to peace and security, we have fundings, even more fundings. But most of the time, it comes for emergencies. It's come for a very short time. And partners, usually when they bring in the fundings, they have so many conditions that you don't have time to apply, local solution, either to involve youth because they are not always there to take decisions. And so my question is, do you really think that the funding is an issue or could be a solution instead of trying the way to bring in local solution in funding, not just importing funding from elsewhere, but pushing more and more local authorities to provide enough funding? Because I don't know if still we can have partners coming from outside and give you sustainable solutions, taking in case local capacities and youth to be involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have a say that whenever we don't know how to solve a problem, we throw more money at it, basically. So I think your question relates to that. But who would like to?
If we contextualize this to Afgoye in Somalia, and we say that we would want the local government to provide the funding. It is a very local government that isn't able to provide basic services that drives the individuals into the arms of armed groups. So then there isn't an issue. From the youth perspective, there isn't an issue with getting the funding. The question is, how do you use that funding? Are you attracting young people and building their capacity to be able to become change makers? Because I understand that you said there could be some times where youth aren't readily available to take the decision. Now the question is, are they available or did you not look for them? So then it's very important to acknowledge the role of funding in building that capacity for them to be able to take that decision. And it isn't something that could hinder them from doing so.
Thank you very much. I think this can summarize a little bit our session, that it's not about the amount of resources, but what you do with it that makes the difference. So we are finishing now this panel, and please join me in thanking the panelists for this very interesting discussion.